All right, so are you ready for a deep dive into something pretty wild?
Yes.
We got some information sent in about bounty hunters going after illegal immigrants in the U.S. And honestly, at first glance, it kind of felt like something out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah, it's got that whole like action thriller thing going on. But what really caught my eye was how it mixes politics, business, and tech all together in a way we haven't really seen before.
Yeah, exactly. Like, let's just break this down for a sec. We're talking about a program that's up and running right now in Mississippi. They're using private contractors, basically modern-day bounty hunters, you could say, to round up undocumented immigrants.
Right, and these contractors, they get paid for every person they catch. Something like $1,000 each is what we're hearing. And the sources, they even mention that this whole program might expand beyond immigration. They might even use it for things like taking back cars that haven't been paid for, or even giving more power to those private security companies.
Wow. So this thing could blow up into a whole new industry, huh?
Yeah.
But let's zoom in on something that really jumped out from all these sources,
Yeah.
okay? The technology these bounty hunters are using. Apparently there's this device, or maybe it's an app, we're not totally sure. But it gives them like the exact location of their target in real time, kind of like how those ride-sharing apps work.
Yeah.
But instead of picking someone up, they're, well, apprehending them.
Yeah, that's the part that gets really interesting. A bit creepy, if you ask me. The sources, they don't give us all the details, but this technology, it raises so many questions like what kind of data is it using? How does it actually track people? We all know that location tracking is a thing, but this level of precision, that's where things get really kind of scary, you know?
You can't help but wonder, right, like, are these people even aware that they're being tracked? What are the legal
What's your
issues?
look like?
The ethical ones, too.
Yeah.
This is intense monitoring we're talking about, especially when it's being done by private companies, not even the government.
To really get a grip on what this all means, we got to understand the technology itself, you know? Think about the ways we track location now. We got GPS cell phone stuff, even facial recognition in public places. This new tech, though, it seems to go way further. But how? Is it taking data from when people cross the border? Is it using something we don't even know about yet? That's the part that needs more digging for sure.
And it's not like this is happening in a vacuum either. Remember a few years back when all those cities were misusing facial recognition? Or all those apps that said they could track your friends but were actually riddled with privacy problems? This feels like that same kind of situation, where they're just throwing tech at a problem without really thinking about what could happen.
You're right on the money there. And this is where mission creep comes in. It's the idea that you make a technology for one specific purpose, but then it ends up getting used for all sorts of other things, things you never even intended. And sometimes those new uses, well, they clash with our values and our expectations about privacy.
It's like that classic sci-fi trope, you know, the one where a seemingly harmless invention gets twisted and used for something totally different and usually pretty bad.
That's exactly it. It shows how important it is to think not just about what a technology can do today, but what it could be used for tomorrow, especially when you've got private companies chasing profits who are involved.
So we've got this program happening in Mississippi, but there's a bigger conversation we need to have about the power of technology and how it can be misused. But before we go too far down that road, let's try and understand this program itself a bit better. Who gave the green light for this thing? What companies are pulling the strings?
Good point. We need more context to understand why this is happening and who made the decisions that got us here. The sources mention a few of the private contracting firms, but they don't give us much background on them or how they were chosen. That's definitely something we should dig into more.
Yeah, getting a clear picture of who's involved and what the rules are around this whole program. That'll help us figure out the risks and maybe even the benefits. But I think we can all agree on one thing. This is a situation that raises a ton of questions about privacy, about who's responsible, and about what role technology should play in law enforcement.
Totally. One thing that really stood out to me in all the stuff we read was how unclear the legal side of things is. I mean, we've got laws about surveillance and due process and all that, but do those even apply here? It feels like we're in completely uncharted territory.
You're hitting on something really important there. It makes you wonder what kind of oversight even exists. Who's making sure these private contractors are playing by the rules? Or if there even are any rules to follow.
And going back to the tech for a sec, one of the sources mentioned that the system might be tapping into smart city infrastructure.
Mm.
Now, I know not everyone's up on that stuff, but basically, smart cities use all these sensors and cameras and data to manage things like traffic and keep people safe.
Oh, okay. I see where you're going with this. So you're saying this bounty hunter app could be pulling data from those city systems. That's a ton of information that could be feeding into something with hardly any oversight at all.
Exactly. And that opens up a whole new can of worms. Think about it. Data that's meant for controlling traffic lights could end up being used to track people. It really blurs the line between keeping the public safe and invading people's privacy.
It's funny you bring up privacy. A while back there was this case where a company was using data from fitness trackers to deny people health insurance.
Hmm.
It's not directly related to this bounty hunter thing, but it shows how data that's collected for one reason can get twisted and used in ways we never imagined. And sometimes that can have really bad consequences.
That's a perfect example of how data can be turned into a weapon without anyone even realizing it. And it shows why we need strong rules and protections to keep people safe from that kind of abuse.
But let's circle back to these bounty hunters for a minute. The sources were kind of vague on how they actually do their thing. Do they just drive around until they find their target? Do they get specific instructions? What's the day-to-day like for them?
Well, from what we've gathered, it sounds like they get orders or assignments, almost like those gig economy apps,
Yeah.
Uber and stuff. It seems like the app tells them where the person they're supposed to catch is and gives them other info too.
So they're basically getting pings on a map with instructions. That sounds super efficient, but also kind of dehumanizing, don't you think?
It definitely raises some ethical questions about how we treat people,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to immigration. It feels like they're turning a complicated situation with real human lives at stake into just data points and to-do lists.
It reminds me of that case a few years back where a hospital was using an algorithm to decide who got priority for organ transplants. They thought it would be objective and efficient, but it ended up discriminating against certain groups of people.
Another great example of how tech can make existing biases and inequalities even worse. Even when the intention is to be neutral, it really underscores why we need humans involved and ethical considerations in any system that affects people's lives.
This whole situation is really making me think about the balance between security and freedom. I mean, I get wanting a system that's good at enforcing immigration laws, but at what cost? Are we willing to give up privacy and due process just to make things more efficient?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something we should be asking ourselves, not just about immigration, but everywhere that technology is playing a bigger role.
We were talking about location tracking earlier, and it reminded me of those stingray devices that police use to track cell phones. Could that be what's going on here?
It's possible, but the sources didn't specifically mention stingrays. Those things basically act like fake cell phone towers so they can grab data, and they've been used in investigations for years. But they're controversial because they can scoop up data from innocent people too.
That brings up another worry. What about collateral damage? If this bounty hunter tech works in a similar way, are they accidentally collecting data on people who aren't even their targets? That feels like a huge invasion of privacy.
And it highlights the need for transparency. Right now, we're just guessing about how this tech works because they're keeping it all hush-hush. Without transparency, it's impossible to know what the risks are and make sure there are safeguards in place.
Okay, so we've gone over the program itself, the tech they're using, and some of the legal and ethical questions. But we also need to talk about the people involved, both the bounty hunters and the ones they're targeting. We've talked about how this tech could be used for other things, but we should also talk about the people involved. Like, what kind of person becomes a bounty hunter in this kind of situation? I mean, what's going through their heads, especially when they're tracking down people who haven't really committed a crime like we usually think of?
That's a good question, and one that our sources don't really answer. You got to think it takes a certain type of person to do this kind of work. Maybe someone who sees themselves as upholding the law, even if they have to bend the rules a bit.
It makes you wonder if there's a chance for things to get out of hand, right? Like,
Yeah.
we've seen regular cops go too far. So how can we be sure that these private contractors who are basically acting like cops are going to stay in line?
That's why it's so important to have good oversight and rules. We can't just give people these powerful tools and hope they'll use them the right way. We need clear guidelines, training, and ways to hold people accountable so things don't get abused and everyone's rights are protected.
And what about the people being hunted? The sources say a lot of them are just trying to live their lives, working, raising families, being part of their communities. How does living with this constant fear of being caught, especially with this tech, watching them, how does that affect their lives?
It's easy to get lost in the technical stuff and the policy debates, but we got to remember that this is about real people. Imagine the stress of knowing that you could be found and arrested at any time. It creates this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that affects everything they do.
It almost feels like we're creating a system where some people are constantly being watched while others get to have their privacy and freedom.
It's a scary thought, and it makes you wonder what kind of society we're building. Are we okay with a future where certain groups are under constant surveillance just because of their immigration status?
We should also think about what happens down the road. What happens when a whole generation grows up being watched all the time? Does that make people trust the government less? Does it create a culture where everyone's afraid and just does what they're told?
These are questions we all need to think about. We can't just pretend they're not there. We need to talk openly and honestly about the balance between security and freedom and make sure that our decisions reflect our values and respect for human dignity.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. We started with bounty hunters and illegal immigrants, but look where we ended up. We're talking about technology, privacy ethics, and the very foundation of our society.
It shows that even something that seems simple can have huge consequences. And it reminds us how important it is to think critically, stay informed, and have these tough conversations about the choices we face as individuals and as a society.
So to wrap things up, I think the message is clear. We can't just sit back and let technology control our future. We have to be involved in shaping that future, asking the hard questions, demanding transparency, and holding the people in power accountable. The future of our privacy, our freedom, and our very humanity depends on it.
Well put. The choices we make today will have a huge impact on the world we live in tomorrow. So let's make sure those choices are informed, thoughtful, and in line with the kind of society we want to create.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, knowledge is power. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking questions.